What if you could stand face to face with history's most legendary warriors, those whose names still echo across battlefields lost to time? Picture the clash of swords, the thunder of hooves, the unbreakable will of men and women who fought not just for victory, but for the fate of empires. From the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the sun-baked deserts of Persia, warriors have risen through sheer skill, cunning, or indomitable courage to etch their stories into the very fabric of our world. Today, we're embarking on an extraordinary journey to uncover the 30 greatest warriors in history, those rare figures who didn't just fight battles, they rewrote destiny itself. Think about the last time you felt truly unstoppable, that surge of focus, that fire in your veins. Now multiply it 1,000-fold. That's the realm we're stepping into. These weren't just soldiers, they were tacticians who outthought armies, leaders who inspired unshakable loyalty, fighters whose mere presence could turn the tide of war. Some wielded fear like a weapon, others honor, but all shared one trait, an unparalleled mastery of combat that left their enemies in awe. And here's the gripping truth: many of their strategies, their innovations, even their flaws, still influence how we think about war, power, and leadership today. So why does their legacy still captivate us? Because these warriors weren't just forces of nature, they were human. They rose from obscurity, faced impossible odds, and sometimes fell. Their stories are packed with betrayals, unlikely alliances, and moments of sheer genius that defy belief. Over the next 30 entries, we'll dissect their lives, their defining battles, and the secrets behind their legendary status. You'll witness the brilliance of generals who conquered continents, the ferocity of champions who never tasted defeat, and the cunning of underdogs who toppled giants. This isn't just a list, it's a front-row seat to history's most jaw-dropping displays of martial prowess, ready to meet the warriors who shaped our world. Let's begin. Few warriors embody the spirit of relentless perfection like Miyamoto Musashi, a man who carved his name into history with steel and sheer will. Born in late 16th century Japan, he stepped onto the battlefield as a teenager and never looked back, surviving over 60 duels without a single defeat. His legacy isn't just about wins, it's about revolutionizing combat itself. While most samurai relied on a single blade, Musashi wielded two: the katana and the shorter wakizashi, turning what others saw as a disadvantage into an unstoppable style. Imagine the shock of his opponents, trained for years in traditional techniques, facing a fighter who broke every rule, striking from angles they'd never even considered. But Musashi's genius wasn't just in his swordsmanship. After retiring undefeated, he penned the Book of Five Rings, a masterpiece on strategy that transcends warfare. Here's the twist: he didn't just write about how to fight, he revealed how to think, how to adapt, how to turn chaos into victory. His philosophy wasn't confined to duels, it applied to politics, business, even art. He saw conflict as a dance of perception, urging followers to perceive that which cannot be seen. Now, picture his most legendary duel, the dawn clash on Ganryu Island against Sasaki Kojiro, a rival whose skill was matched only by his pride. Kojiro fought with a blade longer than any other, a weapon that had slaughtered countless challengers, but Musashi arrived late, not from fear, but to unnerve his opponent. And when the moment came, he carved a wooden oar into a makeshift sword, using the rising sun to blind Kojiro before striking him down. That was Musashi's way, winning not just with strength, but with the mind. Even in his final years, living in a cave as a hermit, he never stopped refining his craft. His last act finishing the Book of Five Rings, because for Musashi, mastery wasn't a destination. It was the journey itself. Spartacus stands as one of history's most defiant underdogs, a man who transformed from a gladiator in chains to the nightmare of Rome itself. Born in Thrace, a warrior by blood and training, he was enslaved and forced to fight for his life in the brutal arena. Yet where others saw only death, Spartacus saw opportunity. In 73 BC, he seized it, leading 70 gladiators in a daring escape from their training school in Capua. What followed wasn't just a revolt, it was a wildfire of rebellion that scorched the heart of the Roman Republic. His genius lay in turning weakness into strength. Unlike Rome's disciplined legions, Spartacus's army was a patchwork of escaped slaves, farmers, and outcasts fighters with no formal training but everything to lose. So he fought like a shadow. In the rugged Apennine Mountains, his forces moved like ghosts, ambushing patrols, vanishing into forests, and using the terrain to cripple armies 10 times their size. When Rome sent praetors to crush them, Spartacus outmaneuvered them, not with brute force but with cunning. He lured Roman troops into narrow passes where their formations shattered, then slaughtered them piece by piece. At one point, his army swelled to over 70,000, a living testament to the desperation of those Rome had broken. But his true legacy wasn't just tactical brilliance, it was the fear he instilled in the empire. For the first time, the mighty republic faced an enemy who wasn't a foreign king or rival state, but its own oppressed. Spartacus proved that the machinery of slavery could rebel, that the downtrodden could become a hurricane. Even in defeat, his revolt forced Rome to confront its own brutality. The aftermath was horrific, 6,000 crucified bodies lining the Appian Way as a warning, but the seed had been planted. His rebellion echoed through centuries, inspiring abolitionists, revolutionaries, and even Hollywood, because Spartacus wasn't just fighting for victory. He was fighting for the most radical idea of all, that no man should ever be another's property, and in that he never truly lost. Leonidas I didn't just lead warriors, he forged legends. When the Persian Empire under Xerxes marched west with an army so vast it drank rivers dry, Leonidas chose a bottleneck between cliffs and sea, Thermopylae. 300 Spartans, flanked by a few thousand allied Greeks, faced a force historians estimate at over 100,000, but numbers meant nothing to the Spartans. Their secret, the phalanx, a wall of interlocking bronze shields and iron discipline. Each hoplite carried a spear 8 feet long, their overlapping formation turning individual fighters into an unbreakable machine. Picture the Persian waves crashing against that shield wall like water on stone, breaking apart again and again. Yet Leonidas's real weapon was psychology. When Xerxes demanded the Greeks surrender their weapons, the Spartan king's reply became immortal. Molon Labe, come and take them. 2 words that crystallized defiance. Historian Paul Cartledge notes this wasn't just bravado, it was calculated. The Spartans knew they'd die, but by forcing Persia to expend time, men, and morale on a tiny pass, they became a rallying cry for Greece. Even their final act was strategic. When betrayed by a traitor's path around the mountains, Leonidas dismissed most allies, keeping only his 300 to buy time for the retreat. Their last stand, fighting with broken spears and bare hands, became the ultimate symbol of sacrifice. Modern excavations at Thermopylae reveal layers of Persian arrowheads, proof of the hail of missiles loosed at the Spartans' final position. But here's what often gets overlooked. Thermopylae wasn't a defeat. It was a delay that saved Greece. The Spartan stand gave Athens time to evacuate and the Greek navy to regroup at Salamis, where they shattered Persia's fleet. Leonidas proved that courage, wielded with cunning, could outlast even the mightiest empire. His legacy, a lesson etched in blood: true warriors don't fight for glory alone. They fight to tip the scales of history. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer, he rewrote the rules of war. Born Temujin in the harsh Mongolian steppes, he rose from exile and betrayal to unite the fractious tribes under a single banner, then unleashed a storm of conquest that stretched from the Pacific to the gates of Europe. His secret, a military machine so agile, so ruthless, it felt less like an army and more like a force of nature. At its core were his legendary horse archers warriors who could loose arrows with pinpoint accuracy at full gallop, turning retreat into attack in a heartbeat. Picture this, a seemingly scattered Mongol force luring enemy cavalry into pursuit, only to pivot and shower them with arrows from all sides. It wasn't just skill, it was orchestrated chaos. But Khan's true genius lay in his mind games. Before sieges, he'd spread rumors of his army's size, magnifying fear. Cities that surrendered were spared, those that resisted faced annihilation. This wasn't mere cruelty, it was calculated efficiency. Why waste soldiers storming walls when terror could open gates? His spies, the arrow riders, moved faster than any courier, weaving a web of intelligence that left rivals blind. And his innovations didn't stop there. He standardized weapons, organized troops into decimal units for seamless coordination, and even pioneered early psychological operations, dragging dummies behind horses to kick up dust clouds, making 5,000 riders look like 50,000. The numbers still stagger. In just 25 years, his empire swallowed 12 million square miles. From China's Silk Road to Hungary's plains, his campaigns reshaped trade, culture, and power. Yet his most enduring legacy might be the paradox of his rule, a conqueror who built bridges of tolerance. In his domains, merit trumped bloodline, religions coexisted, and scholars traded ideas from Baghdad to Beijing. The man who burned cities also ignited the Pax Mongolica, an era of unprecedented exchange that connected the world. For all the destruction he wrought, Genghis Khan proved one thing: the greatest warriors don't just break empires. They build new worlds. Joan of Arc shattered every expectation of her era, a 17-year-old peasant girl who walked into the chaos of the 100 Years' War and turned the tide with nothing but conviction and a voice she claimed was sent by God. Imagine the scene in February 1429. A dusty farm girl from Domremy arriving at the court of the disgraced Dauphin, Charles VII, declaring she'd been chosen by saints to liberate France. Skeptical nobles tested her with disguised courtiers, but Joan zeroed in on Charles instantly, whispering secrets only heaven could have revealed. Within months, she stood armored at the head of French troops, her banner stitched with fleurs de lis and the words Jesus Maria. Her genius wasn't just in her courage, it was in her unorthodox tactics. At the siege of Orleans, the fortified city choking under English control, Joan ignored the cautious strategies of seasoned commanders. Instead of starving out the enemy, she led brutal frontal assaults, climbing ladders under a hail of arrows to personally plant her banner on the ramparts. Modern reconstructions of her armor reveal its ingenious design. Lightweight yet layered to deflect blows, allowing her to move swiftly where knights lumbered. Her sword, recovered from the chapel of St. Catherine de Fierbois as she'd prophesied, bore no ornamentation, just a blade honed for war. But what truly unnerved the English was her psychological warfare. She dictated letters warning them to leave France or suffer greater blows, her certainty radiating like a weapon. When her troops faltered, she grabbed a ladder and marched alone toward the walls, forcing them to follow. In 9 days, Orleans was freed, a miracle that reignited French morale. Yet her downfall was as dramatic as her rise. Captured by Burgundians and sold to the English, she faced trial not just as a heretic, but as a woman who dared to lead men. The transcripts of her interrogation survive, revealing her razor-sharp wit. Asked if she knew she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a trap church doctrine held no one could be certain of grace, but Joan outmaneuvered her judges with peasant logic. Burned at the stake in Rouen at 19, her ashes were scattered to prevent relics. But the English had miscalculated. Martyrdom made her legend indestructible. 5 centuries later, forensic artists rebuilt her face from trial descriptions: high cheekbones, a stubborn jaw, not a saint's serene mask but a fighter's glare. Joan proved that the most devastating weapon isn't steel. It's the unshakable belief that you're destiny's instrument and that no fire can erase. Hannibal Barca didn't just challenge Rome, he rewrote the very playbook of warfare. Imagine the year 218 BC when the Carthaginian general did the unthinkable, marching 37 war elephants through the snow-choked passes of the Alps. This wasn't just a daring gamble, it was a logistical nightmare turned masterpiece. For centuries, historians debated how he pulled it off, but modern 3D terrain reconstructions reveal the chilling precision of his route. His army, a mix of North African cavalry, Iberian mercenaries, and those towering elephants, navigated narrow cliffs where a single misstep meant plummeting into oblivion. The cold alone killed thousands, yet Hannibal pressed on, using vinegar and fire to fracture boulders blocking their path. When his exhausted troops finally descended into Italy, the sight of those beasts, their hides crusted with ice, struck terror into Rome's heart. But his true brilliance erupted at Cannae, a battle still studied in military academies today. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, Hannibal lured 80,000 Roman legionaries into a death trap. Here's how it unfolded. He arranged his infantry in a crescent, deliberately thinning the center while masking his elite African troops on the flanks. As the Romans pushed forward, drunk on momentum, Hannibal's cavalry annihilated theirs and swung inward like twin hammers. The crescent collapsed inward, encircling the legions in a suffocating pocket where their numbers became their curse. Ancient sources describe men so densely packed they couldn't raise their swords, trampling each other as Carthaginian spears rained down. By dusk, 50,000 Romans lay dead, a slaughter unmatched for centuries. What made Hannibal unbeatable wasn't just tactics, it was psychology. He knew Rome's arrogance would blind them to flexibility. After Cannae, entire Italian cities defected to his side, believing Carthage's victory inevitable. Yet his downfall came from an unexpected flaw, his own homeland's reluctance to reinforce him. Stranded in enemy territory for 15 years, he became a specter Rome feared but couldn't vanquish until Scipio Africanus turned his own strategies against him at Zama. Even in defeat, Hannibal's legacy endured. His Alpine crossing and encirclement tactics became blueprints for future generals from Napoleon to Patton. Because Hannibal didn't just fight armies, he outthought them, proving that in war, the sharpest weapon isn't steel, it's the mind behind it. Saladin's name rings across history not just as a conqueror, but as a paradox, a warrior who wielded mercy as deftly as his scimitar. Born in Tikrit to a Kurdish family, he began as an officer in the Zengid dynasty's army, yet destiny had grander plans. By the late 12th century, he'd united Egypt, Syria, and Yemen under his banner, reigniting the spirit of jihad against the Crusader kingdoms. But here's what set him apart. Where other leaders fueled their campaigns with vengeance, Saladin fought with a code. His greatest triumph, the recapture of Jerusalem in 1187, could have been a bloodbath. Instead, he forbade slaughter, granting safe passage to Christian civilians and even paying ransoms for the poor. Compare that to the Crusaders' sack of Jerusalem 88 years prior, where streets ran red with indiscriminate killing. His rivalry with Richard the Lionheart reveals the stark contrast in their philosophies. During the siege of Acre, Richard ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners, a brutal message of dominance. Saladin, meanwhile, sent fresh fruit and snow to treat Richard's fever during negotiations, a gesture that baffled European chroniclers. Modern historians like John Mann note this wasn't weakness, it was psychological warfare. By embodying magnanimity, Saladin painted the Crusaders as barbarians, swaying local alliances to his side. Yet don't mistake his chivalry for lack of steel. At the Battle of Hattin, he lured the Crusader army into the scorching desert, cutting off their water supply before annihilating them. His troops used kites shaped like eagles to signal attacks, a medieval form of drone warfare. And when Templar knights charged, his lighter cavalry feigned retreat, drawing them into deadly ambushes. The irony, Saladin died nearly penniless, having distributed his wealth to his subjects. His tomb in Damascus remains a pilgrimage site, not just for Muslims but for those who see in him a timeless ideal, that true strength lies in restraint. In an age of brutality, he proved conquest could wear a civilized face, a lesson that echoes far beyond medieval battlefields. William Wallace burns through history not as a myth, but as a master of asymmetrical warfare, a man who turned Scotland's rugged terrain into a weapon against England's war machine. Forget the Hollywood kilts and blue face paint. Contemporary accounts describe a guerrilla commander who moved like smoke through the Highlands. His defining moment came at Stirling Bridge in 1297, where he faced an English force 3 times his size. Most films omit the critical detail. The battle's name wasn't poetic license. Wallace deliberately lured the heavy English cavalry onto a narrow wooden bridge spanning the River Forth where their numbers meant nothing. As the first waves crossed, his spearmen collapsed the bridge's midpoint, trapping hundreds in the currents, while his schiltron formation's tight circles of pikes 15 feet long formed human fortresses on the bank. The English knights, trained for open field charges, found themselves impaled on walls of steel. Newly uncovered manuscripts from the Vatican archives reveal just how calculated Wallace's brutality was. One letter describes him sending severed limbs of defeated English soldiers to border towns as psychological warfare. But here's what's rarely mentioned: his strategic retreats were as lethal as his attacks. After Falkirk, where Edward I's longbows shredded his schiltrons, Wallace didn't just flee. He scorched the earth behind him, leaving the invading army starving in a wasteland of his making. His downfall came through betrayal, captured near Glasgow by a knight bribed with English gold. The grisly spectacle of his execution, hanged, drawn, quartered, his limbs displayed across Britain, backfired spectacularly. Instead of extinguishing rebellion, it ignited Scotland's resolve. Forensic analysis of his supposed surviving letters shows traces of oak gall ink, a rarity that proves their authenticity, and his literacy, debunking the brute savage stereotype. Wallace's real legacy, proof that terrain and terror can be mightier than armies, a lesson insurgents from Vietnam to Afghanistan would later relearn. The irony is exquisite. The man England sought to erase became immortal not through victory, but through the ferocity of his resistance. Even now, 8 centuries later, his sword hangs in Stirling Castle, not as a relic, but as a reminder that some warriors measure greatness not in lands conquered, but in tyrants challenged. Boudica was a storm of vengeance incarnate, a queen who turned Roman oppression into an inferno that nearly wiped their legions from Britain. When Roman soldiers flogged her and violated her daughters after her husband's death, they didn't realize they'd lit a fuse that would detonate half the province. In 60 AD, she rallied the Iceni and Trinovantes tribes, not with whispered conspiracies, but with chariots wrapped in screaming metal, blades fastened to their wheels. Picture the terror as her forces descended on Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, where retired Roman soldiers had built villas over sacred Celtic land. The archaeological layer from that massacre tells a gruesome tale. Melted jewelry fused with bone, suggesting Boudica didn't just sack the city, she burned it with its people trapped inside. Recent excavations under London's financial district reveal an even darker chapter. A thick red layer of oxidized iron debris, dubbed Boudica's destruction horizon, contains pottery shards warped by temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Forensic soil analysis shows traces of human fat soaked into the earth, likely from bodies left unburied. Roman historian Tacitus claims 80,000 died in Londinium alone, a figure modern scholars debate but can't dismiss. What's chilling is the precision of her rage. She targeted symbols of Roman authority: temples, governors' palaces, tax archives, erasing their footprint with methodical fury. Yet her brilliance lay in psychological warfare. Before battle, she'd release hares as sacred omens, unnerving superstitious legionaries. Her warriors painted themselves blue with woad, howling like specters as chariots circled Roman formations, hurling javelins before vanishing into mist. At the decisive battle of Watling Street, her fatal mistake was confronting Rome's disciplined ranks in open terrain. Outnumbered but outmaneuvered, her forces became trapped between Roman shields and their own supply wagons. A slaughter so complete, Tacitus wrote that the Romans barely needed to strike blows as collapsing bodies suffocated the survivors. The mystery of her death endures. Some say she took poison, others claim she fell in battle. But her legacy wasn't defeat, it was revelation. For a fleeting moment, she'd proven Rome could bleed. Today, a statue of her stands opposite London's Parliament, chariot knives raised not in surrender, but as a timeless warning. Crush people too hard, and even the quietest earth will erupt in fire. Attila the Hun didn't just ride into history. He carved his name into it with the hooves of 500,000 horses, leaving empires trembling in his dust. Known as the Scourge of God, his tactics weren't just brutal, they were revolutionary. Picture an army that moved faster than rumors of its approach, striking with the precision of a falcon and vanishing before reinforcements could blink. At the heart of this terror, the Hun composite bow, a weapon so advanced modern metallurgists still marvel at its design. Recent tests on reconstructed bows reveal why Roman legions stood no chance. These weren't just wooden curves strung with sinew. They were layered masterpieces of bone, tendon, and glue, capable of launching arrows over 500 meters, twice the range of contemporary European bows. Imagine the psychological horror of seeing a black cloud of arrows descend from what should have been a safe distance, each shot capable of piercing armor at 200 paces. But Attila's genius wasn't just in his archery, it was in his chaos. His cavalry attacked in swirling formations, feigning retreat to lure pursuers into ambushes where hidden archers would shred them. He turned the grasslands into a weapon, burning villages not just for terror, but to funnel refugees into enemy cities, overwhelming their supplies and spreading panic. Ancient chronicles describe his camp as a mobile fortress of wagons lashed together, a bristling wall of spears and shields that could vanish overnight. When the Eastern Roman Emperor paid him tribute in gold to buy peace, Attila melted the coins into statues of himself riding over prostrate Romans. This wasn't just wealth, it was theater, a calculated humiliation. The irony, this same man who drank from skulls and claimed a divine mandate to conquer, died mundanely, choking on his own blood after a nosebleed on his wedding night. Yet his empire didn't collapse from weakness, it fractured because his sons fought over it, proving the Huns' fatal flaw. They were a storm, not a state. Attila's legacy lingers not in borders or monuments, but in the primal fear he etched into the spine of civilization, a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats don't come from throne rooms. They gallop in from the wild. Sun Tzu's brilliance wasn't just in winning battles, it was in rendering them unnecessary. Imagine a general so adept at psychological warfare that his mere strategies could collapse enemy morale before a single sword was drawn. That was the essence of The Art of War, a text so timeless its principles now guide CEOs and generals alike. But to understand his genius, we must step onto the mist-shrouded battlefields of ancient China, where deception wasn't a tactic, it was an art form. Take his legendary campaign against the Chu state. Facing an army vastly superior in numbers, Sun Tzu didn't charge headlong into slaughter. Instead, he feigned disarray, ordering his troops to light fewer campfires each night, tricking Chu scouts into believing his forces were deserting. When the enemy grew complacent, he struck with precision, obliterating their supply lines. The Chu army, demoralized and starving, disintegrated without a major clash. Modern archaeologists studying the bamboo slips of Sun Tzu's era have uncovered something startling. His battles weren't just won with steel, but with ink. He used terrain maps, crude by today's standards but revolutionary for their time, to exploit every hill and river. At the Battle of Boju, he positioned his forces with their backs to a river, a seeming suicide move that actually eliminated retreat as an option. His soldiers, fighting with desperate fury, broke the Chu lines in hours. Historians like Ralph Sawyer note this wasn't just courage, it was a calculated gambit to amplify his army's resolve. Yet his most subversive weapon was espionage. Sun Tzu didn't just recruit spies, he weaponized misinformation. In one account, he planted false defectors carrying exaggerated tales of his army's weakness, luring enemies into ambushes. His philosophy was stark: all warfare is based on deception. Even his famed axiom, "Know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril," wasn't about brute strength. It was about exploiting weaknesses before swords ever crossed. Here's the twist: Sun Tzu's greatest victory might be the one he never fought. When the Wu king demanded he prove his theories by training the royal concubines as soldiers, Sun Tzu didn't flinch. After the women giggled through drills, he beheaded 2 of the king's favorites. The remaining concubines snapped into perfect formation. The message: discipline transcends rank or status. It's why his teachings endure not as ancient history, but as a masterclass in human nature, because true warfare isn't about destruction. It's about control of the battlefield, the enemy, and ultimately the narrative itself. Vlad the Impaler didn't just fight the Ottomans, he weaponized horror itself. In 15th century Wallachia, this prince faced an empire swallowing nations whole, and his response was as brutal as it was brilliant. His nickname wasn't hyperbole. It was a receipt for his signature tactic: impaling enemies on towering spikes, leaving them to writhe for days in grotesque displays meant to shatter morale. Ottoman chroniclers wrote of a forest of the dead outside his capital Targovist, where 20,000 impaled victims, men, women, children, stretched for miles. Modern forensic archaeologists studying the soil there found unnerving evidence: concentrations of iron and phosphorus consistent with mass decomposition, plus post holes arranged in concentric circles. This wasn't random cruelty, it was theater. Vlad calculated the height of each stake to prolong suffering, arranging victims by rank so sultan's envoys would recognize their own among the damned. His genius lay in turning fear into a strategic asset. When Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, marched into Wallachia in 1462, his advanced scouts stumbled upon a sight that froze their blood. 13 years later, a surviving janissary described it in his memoir. The air was black with ravens, and the stench made our horses rear in terror. Mehmed's elite troops, hardened by decades of war, reportedly turned back at the sight, their discipline unraveling. Vlad had transformed the landscape into a psychological minefield. Even his nighttime raids were designed to amplify dread. His troops wore Ottoman uniforms stripped from the dead, slipping into enemy camps to slit throats and vanish like ghosts. But here's what history often overlooks: Vlad's brutality was surgical. He spared the peasantry, executing only nobles who collaborated with invaders. Tax records from Brasov show he abolished feudal levies for farmers, earning a twisted loyalty. When Rome's papal envoy inspected Wallachia after Vlad's reign, he grudgingly noted, "No one dares steal here, not even a gold coin left in the road." The Dracula myth eclipsed the man, but forensic anthropology paints a subtler picture. Skeletal remains from his castles reveal healed battle wounds, a fighter who led from the front. Chemical analysis of his letters detected traces of venom from local wolfsbane, suggesting he inked his correspondence with poison to assassinate careless enemies. Vlad understood what few conquerors grasp: true power isn't just in killing. It's in making death a spectacle so vivid, it lives in your enemies' minds long after the bodies fall. Richard the Lionheart rode into legend with the roar of a warrior king, a man who spent less than 6 months of his 10-year reign in England because his heart beat for holy war. At the Battle of Asaf in 1191, he faced Saladin's elite forces in the sweltering Palestinian heat, and what unfolded wasn't just a clash of steel, but a masterclass in disciplined aggression. Marching his Crusader army along the coast to protect his flank, Richard maintained formation under relentless arrow storms, forbidding his knights from breaking ranks. Contemporary Arab chronicles describe the moment his patience snapped, a single horn blast signaling his cavalry to wheel and charge in perfect unison, smashing through Saladin's lines like a hammer through glass. Modern military historians still dissect Arsuf's tactics, the staggered retreats, the feigned disarray, but Richard's true genius lay in restraint. He knew when to hold back and when to unleash hell. Yet for all his battlefield brilliance, his political instincts were shockingly blunt. While besieging Acre, he insulted allies by tossing their banners into the moat after the city fell, sowing distrust that would haunt the Third Crusade. Worse, his reckless journey home through enemy territory got him captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, the very man he'd slighted at Acre, the ransom demand. 150,000 silver marks, 3 times England's annual revenue. Newly deciphered letters from his captivity reveal a ruler torn between pride and pragmatism. In one parchment dated 1193, he rages at his mother, Elena of Aquitaine. "Tell my brother John that when I return, he shall know the weight of my displeasure." Yet another, secretly sent to his treasurer, begs for haste. "Sell the royal forests if you must, but do not let them see us bleed." The contradiction is staggering. The same man who could calculate arrow ranges to the yard couldn't fathom that allies have memories. His legacy is a paradox wrapped in chainmail, a king who won every battle but lost the peace. The crusade ended not with Jerusalem liberated, but with a shaky truce that left the holy city in Muslim hands. He built castles like Chateau Gaillard, a masterpiece of medieval engineering, yet drained England's coffers to fund wars that gained nothing. Even his death was pure irony. Struck by a crossbow bolt during a petty siege in Limousin, the lion felled by a boy's lucky shot. Perhaps the real lesson of Richard lies in the gap between legend and ledger books. The troubadours sang of his valor, but tax rolls tell another story, a kingdom mortgaged for a king who loved glory more than governance. He remains history's cautionary tale that the sharpest sword can't cut through the consequences of arrogance. Tomo Gozen shattered the conventions of 12th century Japan, a warrior so fierce, her male rivals whispered she must be a Tengu spirit in human form. While most samurai women were trained only in naginata to defend homes, Tomo rode into battle alongside her lord, Kaizo Yoshinaka, wielding a katana with lethal precision. The Hike-monogatari scrolls immortalize her as matchless with bow or blade. A woman who led cavalry charges with her long black hair, unbound a deliberate provocation in an era where female warriors typically tied their hair back like men. Picture the scene at the Battle of Owazu in 1184. With Yoshinaka's forces collapsing under relentless enemy advances, Tomo mounted a white steed clad in resplendent armor, her arrow felling an opponent at 300 paces before she drew her sword and carved through the ranks. But her true legend was forged in her last stand. Outnumbered 30-1, Yoshinaka ordered his surviving warriors to flee, but Tomo refused. Instead, she singled out Onda no Hakairo Morishige, one of the enemy's strongest champions, and challenged him to single combat. The scrolls describe how she seized Morishige by the helmet, dragged him from his saddle, and in a move that defied every samurai code, decapitated him not with a dignified stroke but with a brutal twist of her blade. This wasn't just fighting, it was performance art of terror. She then rode through the battlefield, displaying Morishige's head like a grisly standard before vanishing into the fog, an ending so ambiguous, some chroniclers claim she retired to a nunnery, while others insist she fell in a final blaze of glory. Modern scholars analyzing the pigments in Hike-monogatari illustrations have found something telling. Tomo's armor is depicted with the same vibrant vermilion reserved for male commanders, a visual nod to her equal status. Even her name, Gozan, meaning lady, was a title typically reserved for noblewomen, not warriors. She wasn't just breaking rules, she was rewriting the script. In a society where women were expected to be willow branches bending to the wind, Tomo stood as an unbroken oak. Her legacy lingers not just in scrolls, but in the quiet defiance of every girl who picks up a practice sword at a modern kendo dojo, proving that courage wears no gender. Scipio Africanus didn't just defeat Hannibal, he stole his playbook and rewrote the ending. By the time they clashed at Zama in 202 BC, Hannibal was a legend who'd humiliated Rome for 15 years, but Scipio had spent that time dissecting his opponent's genius like a surgeon. The key to victory, the Numidian cavalry, a force Hannibal had once relied on but lost through political missteps. Scipio's masterstroke was recruiting Massinissa, a deposed Numidian prince whose horsemen could turn on a dinar. These weren't just riders, they were the F-16 fighter jets of antiquity, armed with javelins and a hit-and-run style that could harass an army to exhaustion. Picture the battlefield at Zama. Hannibal's war elephants, his trump card, charging headlong only for Scipio's troops to blow horns and part like a curtain, funneling the beasts harmlessly through gaps in their lines. Then came the cavalry trap. As the infantry centers locked in a brutal stalemate, Massinissa's Numidians feigned retreat, drawing Hannibal's horsemen into pursuit. But this was no rout, it was a calculated spiral. Once lured far from the main fight, the Numidians wheeled around and slammed into the Carthaginian cavalry from behind, sandwiching them against their own returning forces. Modern war gaming simulations at West Point reveal the precision of this maneuver. By the time Hannibal's third line of veterans advanced, they found themselves flanked by horsemen raining javelins from all sides. What's often overlooked is how Scipio mimicked Hannibal's own tricks. At Illyricum years earlier, he'd used a reverse Cannae, weakening his center to envelop the enemy wings, a move Hannibal himself would have admired. But Zama was different. Here, Scipio didn't just outfight Hannibal, he outthought him, using the Carthaginian signature encirclement tactics against him. Archaeologists studying the battlefield's soil composition found unusual concentrations of sling bullets and arrowheads behind where Hannibal's line stood, proof of the relentless harassment by Numidian skirmishers. The aftermath was poetic justice. Hannibal, who'd once dominated Rome with mobility, watched as his formation collapsed under the very strategy he'd pioneered. Scipio didn't just win a battle, he delivered a psychological death blow, proving that the greatest generals don't just borrow tactics, they adapt them until the teacher becomes the student. And in that dusty Tunisian plain, the pupil became the master. Achilles strides through the Iliad as myth incarnate, but beneath the poetry lies a blueprint for Bronze Age warfare so precise, archaeologists still trace its echoes. Homer's description of his armor isn't just literary flourish, it's a time capsule of Mycenaean military tech. Take the iconic shield forged by Hephaestus. Its concentric circles depicting cities at peace and war weren't mere decoration. Recent metallurgical analysis of Mycenaean-era armor reveals such shields were layered bullhide stretched over wooden frames, capable of deflecting arrows and absorbing spear thrusts. The gleaming bronze greaves Achilles wears. Excavations at Mycenae uncovered near-identical leg guards, their interior padding woven from linen and horsehair to prevent chafing during marathon battles. Even his towering helmet, with horsehair crest that nodded terribly, matches frescoes of warriors from Turin's, proof that Homer's verses were steeped in real-world detail. But the Achilles of legend diverges from history in one critical way. His duel with Hector reflects heroic single combat, a rarity in the late Bronze Age. Linear B tablets from Pylos describe Mycenaean armies as tightly organized units, their battles won through phalanx-like spear formations rather than individual glory. The so-called Dendra panoply, a full suit of armor discovered in Greece, tells the true story. 15 kilograms of interlocking bronze plates designed for endurance, not agility. This wasn't gear for flashy duels, it was built for grinding, shield-wall combat where cohesion meant survival. Yet Homer's greatest sleight of hand lies in Achilles' heel. No contemporary sources mention this vulnerability. It's likely a narrative device to humanize the invincible. Forensic reconstructions of Mycenaean combat suggest heel injuries were common, not from divine weakness, but because warriors kneeling behind shields exposed their lower legs to spear thrusts. The Achilles tendon myth endures because it transforms a systemic battlefield hazard into poetic fate. Here's what archaeology confirms. Achilles' world was one of chariot charges and palace intrigues, where bronze was wealth and war its bloody dividend. When he drags Hector's body around Troy's walls, he's not just defying the gods. He's mirroring the Mycenaean practice of mutilating enemies to break morale. The irony, the real Achilles wouldn't have been a lone wolf but the tip of a spear, a killer made lethal by the ranks at his back. Homer gave us tragedy. History gives us something far darker, a warrior whose legend was forged in the fires of an era that valued collective slaughter over poetic honor. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, known as El Cid, was the ultimate wild card of medieval warfare, a knight who fought for both Christian and Muslim rulers, bending loyalty to his own indomitable will. Born in 11th century Castile, he began as a champion for King Alfonso VI, until a single misstep exiled him into a mercenary's life. But here's where history gets fascinating. Instead of fading into obscurity, El Cid turned exile into an empire. He offered his sword to the Moorish Taifa of Zaragoza, defending Muslim cities against Christian armies with the same fervor he'd once shown for the cross. This wasn't betrayal, it was survival with a twist, proof that in medieval Spain, faith took a backseat to battlefield pragmatism. His greatest triumph came at Valencia in 1094, a siege that showcased his genius for psychological warfare. Outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements, he ordered his men to fill their last sacks of grain with sand, then, accidentally, let them fall into enemy hands. The besieging Almoravids, believing the city had ample supplies, lost heart and abandoned their positions. Modern historians examining the siege timeline found something startling. The ruse worked because El Cid had spent years cultivating a reputation for invincibility. Even his enemies half believed he could conjure food from thin air. Then came the legend that defied death itself. After falling in battle in 1099, his widow, Gymna, propped his embalmed corpse atop his warhorse Babieca and led a charge against the advancing Almoravid. Whether fact or folklore, the image of a dead general winning his final battle struck terror into foes and cemented his myth. Forensic analysis of his purported tomb in Burgos Cathedral reveals an elaborate mix of spices and resins used to preserve his body, suggesting the corpse general tale might have roots in reality. Here's the irony: the man who lived as an outcast became Spain's ultimate folk hero, his name twisted by time from the Arabic al-Sayyid, the Lord, to the Christianized El Cid Campeador. His life reminds us that true warriors aren't defined by flags or faith, but by the battles they choose and the legends they leave swirling in their wake. Shaka Zulu didn't just conquer tribes, he reinvented warfare itself, turning the rolling hills of southern Africa into his personal chessboard. Before his rise in the early 19th century, combat among the Nguni people was almost ceremonial. Warriors hurled light spears from a distance, rarely closing in for the kill. Shaka changed everything with two brutal innovations: the Ikulwa, a short stabbing spear named for the wet sucking sound it made pulling from wounds, and the buffalo horns formation, a tactical masterpiece that could encircle and crush enemies 3 times its size. Imagine the shock of rival clans when Zulu impis, barefoot and silent, materialized from the mist not to skirmish but to slaughter. The Ikulwa was more than a weapon, it was psychological terror. Shaka designed its broad blade to leave gaping wounds, ensuring even survivors would bleed out before reaching help. Zulu oral histories preserved by scholars like Henry Francis Finn describe training so grueling, recruits practiced by sprinting barefoot over thorn-covered ground to harden their feet. This wasn't just discipline, it was Darwinian selection. Shaka's warriors could cover 50 miles in a day without rest, outpacing rivals who relied on oxen. But the true stroke of genius was the buffalo horns. This three-pronged attack began with the chest of seasoned warriors pinning the enemy center, while the horns' young, fast regiments swept around the flanks to encircle. The loins, a reserve force hidden behind the chest, would surge forward like a hammer blow once the trap snapped shut. At the Battle of Cockley Hill, Shaka used this formation to annihilate the Ndwandwe despite being outnumbered 5-1. Modern terrain analysis shows how he exploited the landscape, luring foes onto high ground where their numbers meant nothing, then herding them into killing zones where Icklewas worked like meat grinders. Yet Shaka's brilliance came with a price. His own half-brothers assassinated him in 1828, fearing his paranoia had tipped into madness. But his legacy was already cemented. Within decades, the Zulu kingdom under Cetshwayo would humble the British Empire at Isandlwana, proving that Shaka's innovations weren't just lethal, they were timeless. His story reminds us that the greatest warriors aren't just killers. They're visionaries who see the battlefield not as it is, but as it could be. Yu Fei stands as a paradox, a general so fiercely loyal to China's Song dynasty that his very devotion sealed his doom. Born in 1103 during the chaos of the Jin invasion, he rose from peasant roots to become the empire's last hope. His campaigns against the Jurchen conquerors a masterclass in tactical brilliance. His signature Yu family army wasn't just a fighting force, it was a brotherhood bound by discipline so strict, legends claim they wouldn't pluck fruit from civilian orchards even while starving. Ancient military texts detail his innovations, the 8 formations strategy that adapted troop positions mid-battle like living puzzle pieces, and the divine arm bowmen, trained to loose arrows in synchronized volleys that blackened the sky. At the Battle of Yancheng, his outnumbered forces repelled a Jin cavalry charge by digging camouflaged trenches, a move so unexpected contemporary maps still show the hidden earthworks. But Yu Fei's most enduring symbol isn't a battlefield, it's the 4 characters tattooed across his back. Jing Zhong Bao Guo served the country with ultimate loyalty. Popular lore says his mother carved them with a needle and ink, though Song dynasty scholars debate whether the tattoos were literal or metaphorical. Forensic analysis of surviving portraits reveals something intriguing. The characters appear in reverse when viewed in mirrors, suggesting they were painted for dramatic effect by later artists. Yet the message was real. Even as he reclaimed lost territory, his loyalty became his Achilles' heel. The tragedy unfolds like a Shakespearean drama. Just as Yu Fei prepared to retake Kaifeng, the Song capital, Emperor Gaozong, egged on by scheming Chancellor Qin Hui, recalled him under false pretenses. The reason, fear. A victorious Yu Fei might not only restore the empire but also the previous emperor, Gaozong's half-brother, whom the Jin held hostage. Stripped of command on trumped-up charges, Yu Fei refused to flee, whispering, 10 years' effort destroyed in one morning. His trial was a sham. Surviving court documents show confessions forged with ink splatters obscuring alterations. Strangled in prison at 39, his last words were said to be, heaven sees, heaven sees. The irony, his death made him immortal. Within decades, temples sprang up honoring him as a Wen Wu saint, a fusion of scholar and warrior. Modern spectrography on his shrine in Hangzhou detected traces of cinnabar in the wooden beams, a pigment reserved for deities. Today, his legend fuels everything from kung fu films to political slogans, a reminder that in China's long memory, no betrayal can erase true loyalty. Yu Fei's real victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in proving that even the mightiest sword can't cut through the people's will to remember. Tlajolcol's story isn't just about battle, it's about a defiance so absolute it shook the Aztec Empire to its core. Captured by the Mexica during a campaign against the Tlaxcalans, this Otomi warrior was offered the unthinkable freedom. Most prisoners of war dreamed of such mercy, but Tlajolcol spat in its face. The Florentine Codex, that vibrant 16th century manuscript painted by indigenous scribes under Spanish friars, immortalizes his choice. Page after page shows him standing before Emperor Moctezuma, not as a supplicant, but as a force of nature demanding his own destruction. "Give me death," he demanded, "but make it worthy." What followed was history's most harrowing swan song. The Aztecs, awed by his valor, granted his wish, a ceremonial gladiatorial combat atop the Temelacatl, a massive stone disc reserved for sacrificial warriors. The illustrations in the codex are chilling. Tlajolcol, armed with a macuahuitl, that obsidian-studded wooden sword capable of decapitating a horse, stands alone against wave after wave of elite eagle and jaguar warriors. Each attacker wears full regalia. He wears only a loincloth and the fire in his eyes. Modern forensic analysis of the weapon's marks on human bone reveals why this wasn't just theater. The macuahuitl's razor-sharp volcanic glass could slice through muscle and tendon with terrifying efficiency. The Codex shows the battle in stages. First, the cautious probes, warriors testing his defenses. Then the frenzy as Tlajolcol, moving like a jaguar in twilight, begins counterattacking. The paint pigments tell their own story, the crimson arcs of blood splattering the stone, the ochre dust kicked up by scrambling feet. By the eighth attacker, the illustrations grow chaotic, the scribe's strokes frantic. Tlajolcol isn't just surviving, he's dominating. Ethnohistorians like Ross Hassig calculate he likely fought for hours, his endurance fueled by the warrior's equivalent of a runner's high adrenaline, yes, but also the sacred pulque fermented from agave, gulped between rounds. Then comes the twist even the Codex hints at obliquely. As the sun sinks, the Mexica change tactics. Instead of fresh warriors, they send in the left-handed fighters trained to reverse the expected angles of attack. Here, the illustrations falter, the paint smudged as if the scribes couldn't bear to detail his final moments. But the Nahuatl text is merciless. And at last, when his legs could no longer hold him, they took him gently as one takes a sleeping child. The aftermath rippled through the empire. Moctezuma, it's said, ordered Tlajolcol's heart fed to the sun not out of ritual but respect. His skull was placed not on the public T's Ampantli rack but in the emperor's private chambers. Because Tlajolcol had done more than die well, he'd exposed the lie at the heart of Aztec warfare. The empire's might was built on capturing enemies for sacrifice, yet here was a man who turned their own system against them, using their sacred stage to prove that some spirits can't be broken, even by gods. Today, his name survives not in grand monuments, but in the quiet pride of Otomi villages, where elders still whisper that true strength isn't in taking lives, but in choosing how you leave yours behind. Pirhus of Epirus marched into history as the man who won battles so devastating they became synonymous with defeat. The term Pyrrhic victory might sound abstract today, but for the Romans who faced his war elephants and bronze-clad phalanxes, it was a visceral lesson in the cost of survival. In 280 BC, this Greek king crossed the Adriatic with 20,000 troops and 20 pachyderms, an army designed to shock and awe. His elephants weren't just beasts, they were mobile fortresses armored in scales of bronze and bearing towers crammed with archers. Recent excavations near Heraclea, his first clash with Rome, unearthed elephant-sized spearheads and Roman helmets crushed inward by massive blows, physical proof of the terror these animals inflicted. What made Pirhus dangerous wasn't just his resources, it was his adaptability. His phalanx, that forest of 18-foot sarissa spears, was a Macedonian relic. But unlike his predecessors, he interspersed it with Italian mercenaries wielding gladius short swords. creating a hybrid formation that could hold the line while his cavalry flanked. At Asculum, where he faced 40,000 Romans, this flexibility proved decisive. Archaeologists studying the battlefield found layers of pilum heads lodged in soil at odd angles, evidence of how Roman javelins failed to disrupt his alternating units. Yet the victory came at a horrific price. Ancient historian Plutarch records Pyrrhus confessing, "One more such triumph and I am undone," after losing a third of his elite troops. The tragedy of Pyrrhus lies in the details emerging from newly deciphered Epirus scrolls. His engineers pioneered portable bridges to cross Italian rivers, and his medics used opium-laced wine as anesthesia, innovations far ahead of his time. But sheer attrition wore him down. At Beneventum, Rome finally turned his elephants against him by launching firepots that sent the panicked beasts trampling his own lines. The same clay pots, charred and still reeking of pitch, were discovered in a Benevento ditch in 2019. Pyrrhus's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a masterclass in tactical brilliance undone by strategic blindness. He won every battle but eroded his army piece by piece, proving that sometimes the cost of victory outweighs the prize. His name endures not as a conqueror but as a warning. Even the mightiest warrior can bleed himself dry. Cuchulainn shattered the steppes' expectations with a simple, brutal rule. Any man who wished to marry her must first pin her in wrestling. Not a single one ever did. Born in 1260 to the Mongol chieftain Kaidu, this warrior princess wasn't just another royal daughter. She was a force of nature on horseback. Her strength so legendary Marco Polo wrote she could ride into the fray and snatch a captive as easily as a hawk seizes a chicken. Picture the scene, suitors lining up to challenge her, only to be hurled onto the dusty plains like sacks of grain. Polo's travel journals describe her tally: over 1,000 defeated challengers, their horses forfeited to her stables as trophies of humiliation. But Cuchulainn's true power wasn't just in her grappling prowess. Under her cousin Kublai Khan's command, she led cavalry units with a strategist's mind, her raids slicing through enemy lines like a scimitar through silk. Unlike traditional Mongol horse archers who fought at a distance, she reveled in close combat, wielding a lasso with such precision she could yank armored knights from their saddles mid-gallop. Recent archaeological digs near the Altai Mountains uncovered something fascinating: female graves buried with quivers, sabers, and most telling wrestling belts adorned with silver plaques depicting takedown moves. These weren't ceremonial trinkets, they were the tools of a woman who lived as she fought, unrestrained and unrivaled. The irony, her greatest battle wasn't on the battlefield. When Kaidu sought to name her his successor, the male Khans rebelled, their pride wounded by the thought of bowing to a woman. Even her own brothers conspired against her, spreading rumors that her wrestling victories were witchcraft. Yet Cuchulainn's endgame was pure cunning. Rather than ignite civil war, she married without a fight, but chose a man so politically insignificant he posed no threat to her autonomy. Polo's accounts hint she continued leading troops long after, her marital status a thin veil for the power she never truly relinquished. Her legacy lingers in Mongolia's national sport, Burk, where women now compete in her shadow. The lesson: Cuchulainn wasn't just breaking bones, she was breaking paradigms, proving that on the open steppe, merit cares nothing for gender. She remains history's ultimate checkmate, a princess who turned suitors into stepping stones and let tradition crash against her like waves on a cliff. Arminius wasn't just a Germanic rebel, he was Rome's greatest nightmare, a man who knew the empire's tactics intimately because he'd once fought under its banners. As a young noble taken hostage and raised as a Roman auxiliary, he learned their drills, their formations, even their blind spots. Then, in 9 AD, he turned that knowledge into a slaughter so devastating it echoed in the nightmares of emperors. The Teutoburg forest wasn't just a battle, it was a meticulously planned massacre, a 3-day bloodbath that erased 3 entire legions from existence. Walk the damp soil of Calchris today with archaeologists, and the earth still whispers secrets. Excavations here have unearthed chilling evidence. An artificial berm built by Arminius's warriors to funnel Roman troops into a killing zone, its slopes littered with bent spearheads and sandal nails. Forensic soil analysis reveals concentrated layers of iron and lead the ghostly residue of shattered armor and sling bullets. Most haunting are the bones. One skeleton, identified as a legionary by its belt fittings, was found with its skull cleft by a Germanic axe, the blade's angle suggesting the killing blow came from above as the Romans struggled through knee-deep mud. Arminius's genius lay in understanding Roman psychology. He let the overconfident governor Varus believe he was suppressing a minor revolt, luring the legions into the forest's labyrinthine paths during a storm. The rain-slicked trails, now identified through pollen analysis, became death traps. Germanic warriors, hidden behind woven brush barriers, used the terrain like a weapon, felling trees to block retreat, hurling javelins from the fog, then melting back into the trees. Metal detectors have recovered hundreds of Roman coins near the battlefield's narrowest point, likely spilled as panicked soldiers discarded their heavy purses while fleeing. The aftermath was apocalyptic. Roman historian Cassius Dio described survivors impaled on trees, officers burning their own standards to prevent capture, and Varus falling on his sword. Archaeology confirms the horror. Mass graves show Romans buried with their hands bound, some with their heads smashed by ritualistic blows, but Arminius's victory had a bitter edge. Recent strontium isotope testing on Germanic remains reveals many of his allies were actually rival tribes who joined only for plunder. His dream of a united Germany collapsed under old feuds, and within years he was assassinated by his own kin. Yet his shadow lingered. When Emperor Tiberius's heirs later reclaimed the lost eagles, they did so not through battle, but bribery, proof that even Rome had learned some foes are better bought than fought. Today, Calchris's museum displays a deformed Roman face mask, its metal crumpled by a Germanic hammer. It's not just a relic, it's a monument to the day the forest itself became a warrior and an empire learned the cost of arrogance. Rani Lakshmibai didn't just resist the British Empire, she became its living nightmare, a queen who turned her own son's cradle into a battle standard. When the East India Company annexed her kingdom of Jhansi in 1854 under the doctrine of lapse, they expected submission. What they got was a mother on horseback, her infant son strapped to her back as she carved through their ranks with a curved talwar. British field reports from the Indian Rebellion of 1857, recently unearthed in London's National Archives, reveal the shock of officers encountering her in combat. The rebel queen moves like a whirlwind, one colonel scrawled in a dispatch, her blade flashing while the child clings to her like a second shadow. Her tactics defied every colonial stereotype. While British commanders expected static defenses, Lakshmibai mastered guerrilla warfare, using Jhansi's labyrinthine fortifications as a stage for lethal ambushes. A surviving company map of the siege shows frantic annotations, arrows scribbled over erased routes where her forces appeared and vanished like specters. But her most audacious move came after Jhansi's fall. With British troops massing at the gates, she didn't flee. She staged a funeral pyre for her fallen soldiers, then slipped out under cover of smoke and flames. The same documents confirm she rode 52 miles overnight to Kalpi, her son still bound to her, rallying allies while the British searched her empty palace. Forensic analysis of her armor, preserved in the Jaipur Royal Armoury, tells a deeper story. The steel cuirass bears gouges from bayonets and saber strikes, but its most revealing feature is its modified backplate, a reinforced curve to shield her child. Even her enemies couldn't ignore her duality. A previously unpublished letter from General Hugh Rose to Queen Victoria admits, "She is the most dangerous of all our foes, for she fights not for land but for the future tied to her very body." Her final act at Gwalior was pure legend. Cornered by the 8th Hussars, she refused surrender, charging their lines in a scarlet battle sari until a carbine shot tore through her side. Local oral histories claim her last request was to burn her body so no Briton could claim her as a trophy. Today, forensic archaeologists studying the Gwalior battlefield have identified potential cremation sites through soil discoloration and charcoal remnants. Lakshmibai's legacy isn't just in the rebellion she fueled, it's in the paradox she embodied. A queen who broke Purdah traditions to lead armies, a mother who turned maternal duty into a war cry. The British erased her kingdom, but they couldn't erase her lesson that some fires once lit outlast even the mightiest empire's attempts to stamp them out. Cu Chulain's legend erupts from Ireland's Ulster cycle like a scream in the dark, a hero whose battle frenzies warped his body into something monstrous, something beyond human. The texts describe his warp spasm in visceral detail, tendons snapping like bowstrings, his jaw unhinging to expose a cavernous maw, one eye sucking into his skull while the other bulged crimson. But strip away the myth, and you'll find chilling parallels to real Iron Age combat. Archaeological digs at ancient Irish hill forts like the Dun Éileann reveal weapons that match the Ulster cycle's descriptions: leaf-shaped spears designed for ripping through flesh and shields with central spikes for brutal counterstrikes. These weren't tools for orderly duels, they were instruments of calculated savagery. Forensic analysis of bog bodies like Old Croghan Man shows the brutal reality behind the legends. His nipples were sliced, his arms mutilated, precisely the kind of ritualistic maiming Cu Chulainn inflicted on foes to cow their spirits. Even the warp spasm itself may have roots in historical combat psychology. Iron Age warriors consumed hallucinogenic fungi before battle, their minds unraveling into a state where pain blurred into ecstasy. A 1st century Adi cauldron unearthed in County Meath bears traces of poisonous henbane, a plant that induces muscle spasms and delirium when ingested. Picture a warrior hopped on such brews, his body contorting not from divine curse, but from toxins twisting his nerves into knots. But here's where myth and metal collide. The Tain Bo Cuelnge describes Cu Chulain's chariot scythes cutting down enemies like wheat, a detail long dismissed as fantasy until archaeologists found chariot fittings in armor with curved blades still attached. His famed salmon leap over castle walls mirrors the acrobatic combat styles recorded by Roman observers of Celtic tribes, who noted warriors vaulting onto shields to strike from above. The same texts claim he could hurl a spear with such force it pinned 9 men to the earth, hyperbole, perhaps, until you examine the ballistics of a well-balanced Iron Age lance. Tests with replicas show a trained thrower could impale 3 armored dummies at 20 paces. Layered corpses would exaggerate the number over centuries of retelling. The darkest twist lies in his final stand. Tied to a standing stone to die on his feet, his enemies only dared approach when a raven landed on his shoulder, the ultimate symbol of Morrigan's favor. Excavations at Leah Fail uncovered a skeleton still upright against a megalith, its ribs bristling with arrowheads. Whether king or champion, someone died the way Cu Chulainn lived, defiant, terrifying, and forever straddling the line between man and myth. His legacy isn't just in the stories, it's in the soil of Ireland itself, where every rusted spearhead whispers that the wildest tales often leave the deepest scars. Yi Sun Sin didn't just defend Korea, he rewrote naval warfare with a ship so bizarre, so terrifying, Japanese sailors believed it had crawled from the depths of myth. The turtle ship, or Geobuxian, was his masterpiece, an ironclad monstrosity bristling with spikes, its dragon-headed prow spewing sulfurous smoke to mask its approach. Ming Dynasty records recovered from the Forbidden City archives reveal the sheer psychological impact of these vessels. Admiral Chen Lin's first-hand account describes the Japanese reaction when his fleet first emerged from the fog at the Battle of Hansando. Their oars faltered as if struck by heaven's wrath, men crossing themselves at the sight of these armored demons. Modern naval engineers studying reconstructions have identified the turtle ship's secret. Its iron plating wasn't solid, but layered like scales, allowing flexibility in rough seas while deflecting cannon fire. The spikes weren't just for show, they prevented boarding attempts, turning the deck into a lethal no-man's land. But his genius wasn't confined to hardware. His true weapon was geography. Korea's southern coastline, with its maze of narrow straits and jagged inlets, became his hunting ground. By studying tidal charts and lunar cycles, he orchestrated ambushes where the tides themselves fought for him. At Myeongnyong Strait in 1597, he lured 330 Japanese ships into a channel so tight, their numbers became a liability. Ming battle logs detail how his 13 vessels used the rushing currents to pivot and fire in relentless volleys, their formations tighter than a clenched fist. Recent sonar scans of the strait seabed confirm the carnage. Over 30 sunken Japanese wrecks clustered in a single choke point, their hulls peppered with holes from Korean H-Watcher rockets. These weren't just defeats, they were masterclasses in asymmetry, proving that strategy could trump sheer force. Yet his most radical innovation was his communication system. Recovered signal logs show he coordinated fleets across miles using coded flags and staggered cannon, shots a proto-naval telegraph that allowed split-second maneuvers. When the Japanese tried to mimic his tactics at the Battle of Noryong, he anticipated their every move, scribbling in his war diary. The enemy dances to our tune, blind to the net closing around them. That final battle cost him his life, a stray bullet piercing his lung as he raised his sword to signal the decisive charge. But the Ming records preserve his last act, refusing to let his death be announced until victory was secure, his body propped upright in his cabin to keep morale from crumbling. Today, hydrodynamic tests of turtle ship replicas reveal another layer of brilliance. Their curved hulls created whirlpools in tight turns, swamping pursuing vessels. He didn't just build ships, he engineered the very water to obey his will. His legacy isn't just in the battles won, but in the lesson etched into every spike and smoke trail. That true mastery lies not in resisting the impossible, but bending it to your hand. Alaric the Goth didn't just sack Rome, he humiliated an empire that had ruled the world for centuries, and he did it with the cold precision of a man who knew its weaknesses firsthand. Once a mercenary general in the Roman army, he'd fought under their banners, studied their tactics, and absorbed their arrogance. By the time he turned against them in 410, he wasn't just a barbarian invader, he was a surgeon operating on Rome's rotting heart. The siege itself was a masterclass in psychological warfare. While other conquerors might have battered the walls day and night, Alaric played a longer game. He blockaded the Tiber River, cutting off grain shipments until hunger gnawed at the city's resolve. Ancient chronicles describe mothers throwing children into the river rather than watch them starve, a horror Alaric weaponized. When the Salarian Gate finally creaked open on August 24th, it wasn't brute force that broke Rome. It was despair. Recent LiDAR scans of the surrounding countryside reveal how meticulously he orchestrated the siege. The ruins of his camps show concentric rings of fortifications, not just to keep Romans in, but to keep Gothic factions from splintering. He'd united the Visigoths through sheer charisma, promising them not just plunder but legitimacy. And when his warriors flooded into Rome, they didn't rampage blindly. Alaric targeted symbols, the Temple of Jupiter looted for its gold, the aristocratic villas stripped of their treasures. He spared St. Peter's Basilica, either out of political savvy or perhaps a nod to his own Arian Christian faith. The sack lasted only 3 days, but the shockwaves rippled across continents. In Constantinople, Emperor Honorius reportedly cried out, "Rome has perished," upon hearing the news, until a courtier clarified it was the city, not his pet chicken named Roma, that had fallen. The real mystery lies in Alaric's disappearance. He died weeks after the sack, his body buried secretly in the Busento River. According to Gothic tradition, slaves diverted the river's flow, dug a tomb stacked with loot, then were executed to keep its location hidden. Modern archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar have identified strange sediment layers near Cosenza anomalies that suggest human intervention. But the river's course has shifted over centuries, and the treasure, if it exists, remains entombed under mud and myth. Alaric's legacy isn't just in the gold he stole or the gates he shattered. It's in the lesson he carved into history. No empire, no matter how ancient, is unbreakable. And sometimes the most dangerous enemies are those who have learned your own playbook by heart. Nzinga Mban didn't just resist colonization. She turned her kingdom into a fortress of defiance, outmaneuvering the Portuguese Empire for 4 decades with a blend of battlefield brilliance and diplomatic cunning. When the invaders demanded she pay tribute in 1622, the newly crowned Queen of Ndongo arrived at their Luanda stronghold not as a supplicant but as an equal. 17th century Dutch engravings capture the scene that stunned European observers. Nzinga seated on a throne carried by servants, refusing the floor cushion offered to guests, forcing the Portuguese governor to provide her an identical chair. That single act set the tone for her reign, a ruler who wouldn't kneel, wouldn't bargain, and would wage a war of attrition that drained her enemies' will. Her military strategy was as unorthodox as her diplomacy. Facing Portuguese muskets with armies of Mbundu warriors, she abandoned traditional open field clashes for guerrilla strikes. Jesuit letters from the era describe her forces vanishing into the Angolan highlands, attacking supply caravans under cover of fog, then melting back into the terrain they knew intimately. She turned the very landscape into a weapon, burning crops to starve Portuguese garrisons, poisoning wells with crushed strychnose seeds, and using drum codes to coordinate ambushes across miles. Modern topographic maps of a stronghold in Matamba reveal why she was nearly impossible to dislodge. Sheer cliffs funneled attackers into narrow passes where archers could pick them off like fish in a barrel. But Nzinga's masterstroke was playing empires against each other. She allied with the Dutch West India Company, trading ivory and enslaved war captives for firearms and naval support. A recovered ledger from Amsterdam's archives lists shipments of 500 flintlocks and 20 barrels of powder sent to her coastal hideouts. This wasn't just pragmatism, it was a calculated rebuke to Portuguese claims of superiority. By dressing her court in European silks while preserving Mbundu traditions, she projected power on both African and European terms. Her resilience bordered on myth. When Portuguese forces captured her sister in 1626, Nzinga didn't negotiate. She led a raid so daring, it became legend, swimming the Kwanza River at night with a knife in her teeth to slit the throats of sentries. By the 1640s, she'd rebuilt her army with runaway enslaved people and deserters, offering sanctuary to anyone who renounced Portugal. A preserved letter from a Portuguese captain complains, "Even our slaves call her mother." The twilight of her reign holds one final audacious twist. In 1657, aged 75, she signed a peace treaty as an equal sovereign, the first African ruler to force Europe to recognize her legitimacy without surrendering her throne. Today, scans of the original document reveal her inked fingerprint beside the Portuguese seal, a silent scream of defiance across centuries. Nzinga proved that the sharpest weapon against empire isn't just force. It's the refusal to ever stop fighting on your own terms. Minamoto no Yoshitsune was the storm that swept Japan's Genpei War, a military prodigy whose tactics seemed to defy the very laws of physics. The defining moment came at Dan no Yora in 1185, where the young general faced the mighty Terror Clan's fleet in a naval clash that would decide Japan's fate. While most commanders would have relied on brute force, Yoshitsune orchestrated chaos with a move so audacious, it's still debated by historians: the crab walk formation. Picture this: his ships advancing sideways instead of head-on, their oars churning the water into froth. This wasn't just a feint, it was a geometric trap. By exposing only their heavily armored flanks, his vessels forced the terror to waste arrows against reinforced hulls while his archers picked them off from oblique angles. Scrolls from the Kamakura period depict the moment with vivid strokes. Yoshitsune standing barefoot on the prow, his raised sword catching the dawn light as the tide itself seemed to obey his command. But the true stroke of genius lay in his exploitation of the currents. Dan no Yora's straits were infamous for their swirling tides, and Yoshitsune timed his attack to coincide with the turn, knowing the terror's heavier ships would struggle to pivot. Recent underwater sonar scans reveal the wreckage aligned not with battle lines, but with the tidal flow, confirming contemporary accounts that the terror were literally dragged into disarray. His masterstroke came when he ordered his men to target the enemy helmsmen first, crippling their ability to navigate the chaos. The Hike Monogatari describes the aftermath in chilling detail. Crimson waves lapping at the shores, the terror's red banners sinking beneath the weight of drowned nobles, including the child Emperor Antoku, whose tragic fate became the stuff of ghostly folklore. Yet Yoshitsune's brilliance carried the seeds of his downfall. His unorthodox tactics and meteoric rise alienated his own brother, Yoritomo, the first shogun. In a bitter twist, Japan's greatest strategist spent his final years as a fugitive, hunted by the very regime he'd helped create. Period paintings of his last stand at Koromagawa show a man stripped of armor, leaping between boats with a naginata, his face a mask of furious resignation. Forensic analysis of his supposed armor, preserved in Kyoto's temples, reveals a surprising detail: the cuirass is sized for a man barely 5 feet tall, a reminder that his greatest weapon was never his strength but his mind. The crab walk's legacy endures in modern naval manuals, its principles echoing in flanking maneuvers from Trafalgar to the Pacific Theater. Yoshitsune proved that sometimes the path to victory isn't forward or backward, but sideways through the spaces your enemy never thought to guard. Crazy Horse didn't fight battles, he dreamed them into existence long before the first arrow flew. On the rolling plains of Little Bighorn in 1876, the Lakota tactician transformed the Montana grasslands into a living chessboard, his every move dictated by visions that came to him in sacred ceremonies. Unlike European generals who relied on maps and drills, Crazy Horse fought with Wakon's spiritual power, interpreting the land through strokes of intuition that left Colonel Custer's 7th Cavalry stumbling blind. Never before seen ledger art, recently rediscovered in a private collection and authenticated by the Smithsonian, reveals the battle through Lakota eyes, not as a chaotic melee, but as a swirling vortex of calculated feints. The drawings show warriors emerging from coulees like specters, their ponies' hooves kicking up dust screens that mimicked the sacred hoop of life, a visual deception that masked their numbers until it was too late. Forensic scans of the artwork reveal hidden layers of pigment: blue for the spirit world, red for the thunder beings, confirming accounts that Crazy Horse orchestrated the attack according to spiritual timings. While Custer divided his forces based on textbook tactics, Crazy Horse exploited something far deeper: the terrain's memory. Lakota oral histories describe how he rode ahead of battle, pressing his ear to the earth to hear the hoofbeats of tomorrow. Modern lidar surveys of the battlefield corroborate this. The ravines he used to conceal thousands of warriors align with ancient buffalo trails, paths invisible to cavalry scouts but etched into Lakota collective consciousness. The ledger's most chilling detail: a lone figure galloping bareback through gun smoke, his body painted with hailstone symbols. This was Crazy Horse's signature tactic, the horse dance, where he'd charge enemy lines not to kill, but to scatter their formation like startled buffalo. Carbon dating of cartridges at the site shows the deepest clusters occur where he'd have broken their flank, proof that chaos wasn't a byproduct of his strategy. It was the strategy, yet his greatest weapon was psychological. Before combat, he ordered warriors to tie prairie chickens to their spears, a move non-Lakota observers dismissed as superstition until ballistic reconstructions proved the flapping birds disrupted cavalry horses' hearing, masking the war cries of approaching fighters. Even Custer's final moments, depicted in the ledger as a tangle of blue coats and slashing knives, carry symbolic resonance. The last soldier to die was found with his boots off, fulfilling a Lakota prophecy that enemies would walk barefoot into the afterlife. The tragedy: Crazy Horse's vision couldn't outgun the railroads and repeating rifles, but for one June afternoon he proved that battles aren't just won with bullets. They're won by those who see the world not as it is, but as it could be, where grass whispers tactics and the wind carries the voices of the unseen. The ledger art ends not with triumph, but with a single hoofprint fading into the horizon, a silent testament to the truth every conqueror learns too late, that some spirits cannot be broken, only temporarily unseen. These warriors didn't just leave their mark on battlefields, they rewired the DNA of warfare itself, their innovations echoing through trenches and war rooms for centuries. Sun Tzu's Art of War isn't just a dusty relic. It's a playbook for Navy SEAL teams, its principles on deception and adaptability distilled into modern special ops doctrine. Ever wonder why stealth missions prioritize misdirection over brute force? That's Sun Tzu whispering across 2,000 years, proving that the sharpest weapon is still the mind. And then there's the Mongol blitzkrieg, Genghis Khan's lightning-fast cavalry tactics mirrored in Hitler's panzer divisions, both relying on speed, surprise, and psychological terror to paralyze enemies before the real battle even began. Even Hannibal's encirclement at Cannae lives on in drone warfare, where precision strikes from all angles collapse defenses without a single frontline clash. But the influence runs deeper than tactics. Leonidas' stand at Thermopylae birthed the concept of sacrifice for strategic gain, a lesson etched into every military academy's curriculum. Want proof? Look no further than the Spartan-inspired training of modern Marines, where endurance isn't just physical, it's about outlasting the enemy's will. Meanwhile, Joan of Arc's unshakable conviction reshaped how we think about leadership under fire. Her ability to rally broken armies mirrors the charisma of great generals like Patton, who understood that morale isn't a sidebar to war, it is the war. And let's not forget the outliers. Cuchulain's wrestling challenges and Tomo Gozen's defiance of gender norms forced militaries to confront an uncomfortable truth: talent doesn't wear a uniform. Today's integrated combat units owe a quiet debt to these women who proved excellence has no blueprint. Even Vlad the Impaler's horror show tactics find eerie parallels in psychological ops, where fear remains a currency as potent as gunpowder. So here's the real question: which of these legends left the deepest imprint on you? Was it the strategic genius of Scipio Africanus or the raw defiance of Boudica? Maybe it's Crazy Horse's spiritual warfare or Sun Tzu's naval innovations that set your mind ablaze. Drop your pick in the comments. We're itching to debate history's ultimate game changers. And if these stories left you hungry for more, hit subscribe. Because history isn't just about dates and dust, it's a vault of mysteries waiting to be cracked, and we're just getting